At 0600 on the morning of October 23, 1942, Geoffrey Barkas stood in the Egyptian desert watching 600 tanks that didn't exist. 46 years old, filmmaker turned military engineer, 6 months into the most audacious deception operation in modern warfare. The real tanks were 20 miles north, disguised as supply trucks. These phantoms were canvas and wood, designed to convince the Germans that Montgomery's main attack would come from the south. If the deception failed, Rommel would concentrate his panzers at the actual breakthrough point. British casualties would be catastrophic. The war in North Africa might be lost. Barkas had seen the intelligence reports. German reconnaissance flights were photographing the dummy positions daily. Rommel's staff officers were analyzing the images. They'd spotted the pipeline Barkas's team had built, stretching 20 miles across empty sand. They'd counted the dummy tanks. They'd observed the fake supply dumps. Everything looked perfect from 10,000 feet. Everything had to look perfect for another 12 hours. By nightfall, Montgomery's 600 real tanks would roll forward from their hiding places. The artillery barrage would begin at 2140 hours precisely. The infantry would advance into German minefields. Men would die. How many depended on whether Barkas's canvas and wood held up under scrutiny for just a few more hours. A Lysander reconnaissance plane circled overhead. British checking the deception from the German perspective. The pilot would report what he saw. If he spotted flaws that German pilots might also spot, there was no time left to fix them. The pilot descended to 500 feet, dangerously low, exactly the altitude German tactical reconnaissance used. He made 3 passes over the dummy positions. His radio crackled. "Deception excellent from here. I count approximately 600 armored vehicles, southern sector, taking photographs for confirmation." Barkas lowered his binoculars. The pilot couldn't distinguish canvas from steel at that altitude, neither could the Germans. The operation was holding, but canvas and wood weren't enough. The Germans had to believe 600 tanks were actually there, not just visible. They had to see evidence of human activity, cooking fires at dawn, vehicle movement, track marks in the sand. Barkas's team had created all of it. Dummy soldiers hanging washing on lines, dummy trucks moving between fake supply dumps, real engineers driving jeeps through the positions, creating authentic tire tracks. It was theatre, the biggest film production Barkas had ever directed, and the audience was Erwin Rommel. If you want to see how Barkas's rubber tanks changed the course of World War II, please hit that like button. It helps us share more forgotten stories from the war. Subscribe if you haven't already. Back to Barkas. The deception problem had started in August 1942. Montgomery needed to attack Rommel's positions at El Alamein. The only viable breakthrough point was the northern sector, near the coast road. Obvious terrain, obvious tactics. Rommel knew it. Montgomery knew that Rommel knew it. Classical military dilemma. Montgomery called for Dudley Clark, head of A-Force, Britain's Strategic Deception Unit. Clark proposed Operation Bertram. Make Rommel believe the attack would come from the south. Make him believe it would come later than planned. Force him to split his forces. If he concentrated in the south, Montgomery's northern breakthrough would face weaker opposition. Clark needed someone who could create the physical deception, someone who understood visual tricks, someone who could build an entire phantom army that would survive scrutiny from German reconnaissance. He called Geoffrey Barkas. Barkas was an unlikely military officer, born in Richmond, Surrey, 1896, to parents from Jersey families. His father was a librarian. Nothing in his background suggested military genius, but Barkas had skills the army desperately needed. He'd survived Gallipoli in 1915. He'd fought at the Somme, earned a military cross. More importantly, he'd spent 20 years making films. Between the wars, Barkas had worked as a writer, producer, director. He'd made silent films. He'd directed features. The Third Gun in 1929, one of the first British sound films. He understood cameras. He understood how images deceived the eye. He knew that what looked real from 50 feet often looked fake from 500, and vice versa. The film industry had been brutal during the Depression. By 1937, Barkas needed work. He joined Shell-Mex BP under Jack Beddington. Beddington recognized something useful in Barkas's film experience. He guided him toward military camouflage work, hiding things from cameras, making real things look fake, making fake things look real. When war started in September 1939, Barkas was rapidly drafted into the Royal Engineers' 10-day basic training course, then camouflage school at Larkhill. They taught him to hide vehicles from aerial photography. They taught him about infrared detection. They gave him the theory. Barkas already had the practice. His first assignment was Northern Ireland, 1940, teaching army drivers how to camouflage vehicles. He discovered that soldiers treated camouflage nets like invisibility cloaks. They'd park trucks in open fields, throw nets over them, assume they were hidden. German reconnaissance would photograph them easily. Barkas developed a different approach. He'd assemble 60 trucks in a training area. He'd ask the NCOs how to hide them. Park by hedges, they'd say, drape nets to look like vegetation, make them look like buildings. Then Barkas would give the signal and his team would hide all 60 vehicles using proper techniques. Moments later, a reconnaissance plane would fly over. It rarely found more than 3 or 4 trucks. The demonstrations worked. Soldiers learned. Barkas earned a reputation as someone who could make things disappear. In December 1940, Barkas and his camouflage team shipped out to Egypt. He arrived in Cairo on January 1st, 1941. The Western Desert was completely different from Northern Ireland. No trees, no buildings, no hedges, just sand, rock, and unforgiving sky. Perfect conditions for aerial reconnaissance, terrible conditions for hiding anything. Barkas flew reconnaissance himself. He studied the desert from the air. He identified patterns he named wadi, polka dot, natural camouflage formations that could hide equipment if used correctly. He started teaching his techniques to British units, but teaching camouflage wasn't enough. The British 8th Army was outnumbered. German and Italian forces had more tanks, more aircraft, more artillery, hiding what you had only worked if you had enough to hide. The British needed to appear stronger than they were. They needed phantom units, dummy equipment, the appearance of overwhelming force. In April 1941, Barkas's team built their first dummy tanks. The Royal Engineers constructed 2 per day, crude at first, wooden frames covered with canvas. They looked convincing from 2,000 feet, but fell apart on closer inspection. Between April and June 1941, Barkas's camoufleurs built 3 complete dummy Royal Tank regiments, 72 tanks that didn't exist. They positioned them in staging areas visible to German reconnaissance. Luftwaffe pilots photographed them. German intelligence counted them. Rommel's staff calculated British strength based on what they saw. The dummy tanks gave British commanders breathing room. Real tanks could be moved without German knowledge. Phantom tanks created the illusion of strength in defensive positions while real armor maneuvered elsewhere. But the early dummies had limitations. They were stationary. They couldn't move. German intelligence officers weren't stupid. If they saw the same tank in the same position for 2 weeks, they'd become suspicious. Barkas needed mobile dummies. He experimented with jeeps. His team built steel frames covered with canvas that could be mounted on jeep chassis, instant mobile dummy tank. A jeep didn't move like a tank. It didn't sound like a tank, but from 5,000 feet, it looked like a tank on the move. The reverse also worked. Real tanks could be disguised as trucks. Barkas developed sun shields, canvas covers that transformed tanks into innocent-looking supply vehicles. Park a squadron of tanks under sun shields, and German reconnaissance would photograph a truck convoy. The first sun shield prototype was built in 1941 by Jasper Maskelyne, a stage magician Barkas had recruited into his camouflage unit. Maskelyne was famous in Britain for his illusion shows. He brought those skills to the desert. The first sunshield was heavy wood. It took 12 men to lift it. It disintegrated during its first trial run on a Crusader tank. Maskelyne didn't give up. He redesigned it. Canvas stretched over a light steel tube frame, strong, light, cheap to manufacture. From 500 feet, RAF pilots confirmed it looked exactly like a truck. In June 1941, the sunshields were tested in combat conditions. Operation Battle-Axe. British forces attacked German positions near Halfaya Pass. Tanks moved into position overnight, covered by sunshields before dawn. German reconnaissance photographed truck convoys in areas that actually contained armoured units. The deception worked perfectly. The battle itself was a disaster. British forces lost 91 tanks. Operation Battle-Axe failed, but the sunshields had proven their value. German commanders had been genuinely surprised by tank concentrations they hadn't detected. After Battle-Axe, Barkas expanded his operations. He recruited artists, theatre designers, zoologists, anyone with creative problem-solving skills. His Middle East Command Camouflage Directorate grew to include hundreds of specialists. They built dummy artillery, dummy aircraft, entire dummy supply depots. One of their most successful early operations was the dummy railway at Mishaifa. Artist Stephen Sykes designed it for Operation Crusader in November 1941. 6 miles of dummy railway, dummy train, dummy sidings, dummy tanks positioned to look like they'd been delivered by rail. The real railhead was at Capuzzo, 20 miles away, bringing actual supplies for the offensive. Barkas needed German bombers to attack Mishaifa, not Capuzzo. The dummy railway had to look convincing enough that Luftwaffe pilots would waste bombs on it. They built it from Garida palm hurdles and scrap materials. From the ground, it looked ridiculous. From 10,000 feet, it looked like a critical supply line. More than 100 bombs were dropped on Mishaifa. German bombers attacked it repeatedly. The raids on Capuzzo were cut in half. Barkas noted that his camouflage men were among the few otherwise sane beings who yearned to be bombed. Being bombed meant the deception was working. Every bomb that hit a dummy railway was a bomb that didn't hit real soldiers. By mid-1942, Barkas's techniques were established throughout the Western Desert. But what Montgomery needed for El Alamein was something far more ambitious than anything Barkas had attempted. Not a dummy railway, not a few dozen dummy tanks, an entire phantom army. On September 16, 1942, Barkas was summoned to 8th Army headquarters near Borg El Arab. Montgomery's Chief of Staff, Freddie de Gingand, introduced him to Charles Richardson from A Force. Richardson explained the plan for Operation Bertram. The numbers were staggering. 600 real tanks had to be hidden in the northern sector. 600 dummy tanks had to be created in the southern sector. Dummy artillery batteries. A dummy water pipeline stretching 20 miles. Dummy supply dumps. Fake vehicle tracks. Evidence of an entire army corps preparing for an offensive that would never happen. And it all had to be built in 6 weeks. The attack was scheduled for October 23rd. Bertram had to be complete by October 15th to give German reconnaissance time to photograph it and report it to Rommel's headquarters. Barkas listened to Richardson's requirements. He didn't say it was impossible. He'd learned in film production that nothing was impossible with enough time, materials, and skilled people. He had 6 weeks. He had materials. He had the best camouflage specialists in the British Army. He told Richardson he'd do it. Barkas made Tony Ayrton his deputy for Bertram. Ayrton was 33, an artist, one of only 5 fully trained camouflage officers in the Middle East when the war started. He'd formed the 85th South African Camouflage Company. He understood large-scale operations. Ayrton would handle the southern deception. Barkas would oversee the northern concealment. They had 2 parallel challenges: make 600 real tanks invisible, make 600 phantom tanks visible. The northern sector was easier conceptually. Real tanks would be positioned in assembly areas behind the front lines. Sun shields would be placed over them. German reconnaissance would photograph what looked like truck parks. The trucks had been there for weeks, nothing unusual, just supply vehicles. 2 nights before the attack, the real tanks would roll forward to their jumping-off positions. They'd arrive under cover of darkness. Before dawn, new sun shields would be installed. The trucks that German reconnaissance had photographed for weeks would still be there, except they'd be tanks. The southern deception was more complex. Creating 600 dummy tanks wasn't the hard part. Barkas's team had been building dummy tanks for 18 months. They had the templates, they had the materials, canvas, wood, steel tube frames. Each dummy could be built in 4 hours. The hard part was making them look lived in, active, real. A tank isn't just a vehicle, it's part of a complex military infrastructure. Tanks need fuel, they need ammunition, they need maintenance facilities, they need personnel. They create evidence of their existence, track marks in sand, disturbed ground around positions, cooking fires, latrines, scattered equipment. Barkas's team had to create all of that evidence for 600 tanks that didn't exist. They positioned the dummies in realistic formations. British tank doctrine called for specific spacing between vehicles. Too close and they'd be vulnerable to artillery. Too far and they couldn't provide mutual support. German intelligence officers knew British doctrine. The dummy positions had to match it exactly. Then came the details. Barkas's team used real jeeps to create authentic track marks leading to dummy positions. They scattered supply crates around dummy tanks. They hung washing on lines near dummy bivouac areas. They lit small fires that would create heat signatures for German infrared reconnaissance. They even created dummy soldiers, inflatable figures that from 5,000 feet looked like men moving around equipment. The dummies couldn't do complex activities, but they could stand. They could create the appearance of human presence. The water pipeline was Ayrton's masterpiece. Montgomery's real offensive would require massive water supplies. Bringing water forward required a pipeline. Building a pipeline took weeks. German reconnaissance would watch its progress. When it was complete, they'd know the offensive was imminent. Ayrton built a fake pipeline in the southern sector, not real pipe, canvas tubes laid across the sand. From the air, it looked identical to construction work. His team advanced it slowly, deliberately, a mile per day. Exactly the pace real pipeline construction would take. German reconnaissance photographed it daily. They tracked its progress. When it was 10 miles from completion, they calculated the offensive was still 2 weeks away. Perfect. The real attack would come when they were still expecting delays. Materials were constantly in short supply. Canvas was rationed, steel was precious, wood was hard to find in the desert. Barkas's team improvised constantly. They salvaged wrecked vehicles for metal. They used captured Italian materials. They even made paint from spoiled food. Rancid flour mixed with Worcester sauce created a revolting but highly adhesive paste. The work was exhausting. Hundreds of engineers and laborers worked 12-hour shifts under brutal desert sun. They built dummies. They positioned them. They created track marks. They planted evidence. They maintained the deception daily because German reconnaissance flew over constantly. Any change had to look natural, planned, authentic. On October 6th, Montgomery gave the final go-ahead. The attack would proceed on October 23rd. Bertram had to hold for 17 more days. Those were the longest days of Barkas's career. He'd created the deception. Now he had to maintain it. German reconnaissance flew over daily, sometimes multiple times per day. Luftwaffe tactical reconnaissance, high-altitude photographic missions, any one of them might spot inconsistencies. On October 15th, a dust storm hit the southern sector, desert winds exceeding 40 miles per hour. The storm ripped through dummy positions. Canvas tore, frames collapsed. Dummy tanks that had looked perfect yesterday were scattered wreckage today. Ayrton's team worked through the storm. They rebuilt collapsed dummies, they replaced torn canvas, they repositioned frames. By the time the storm cleared, the dummy positions looked intact. German reconnaissance photographed them the next day. They saw no damage. Everything appeared normal. On October the 20th, 3 days before the attack, Barkas received reports that made his stomach turn. German intelligence had identified discrepancies in the southern positions. Some of the tanks hadn't moved in 3 weeks. Some were positioned in ways that didn't match standard British tactical doctrine. Barkas couldn't fix the discrepancies. There was no time. He could only hope German analysts would attribute the oddities to British carelessness rather than deception. On October 22nd, the real tanks moved into their assault positions under cover of darkness. Barkas's team installed fresh sun shields before dawn. The truck park in the northern sector now contained 600 tanks. German reconnaissance photographed it that morning. They saw trucks. In the southern sector, the dummy tanks stood waiting, silent, motionless, bait for a trap that would spring in 12 hours. At 2140 hours on October 23, 1942, 1,000 British artillery pieces opened fire simultaneously. The bombardment was devastating. German positions erupted in flames. Montgomery's infantry advanced through minefields. The real tanks, hidden under sun shields until hours before, rolled forward. In the southern sector, Rommel's reserves waited. His panzer units were positioned to counter the attack they'd seen building through reconnaissance, the attack that was coming from dummy tanks. When they realized their mistake, it was too late. Montgomery's breakthrough in the north had succeeded. British forces penetrated German lines. The Second Battle of El Alamein had begun, and thanks to Barkas's canvas and wood, it had begun with British forces holding the advantage. The battle lasted 13 days. It was brutal. British casualties exceeded 13,000, but Rommel's forces were destroyed. The Afrika Korps retreated. They would never recover. El Alamein was the turning point of the North African campaign. On November 11, 1942, Winston Churchill announced the victory to the House of Commons. He specifically praised Operation Bertram. He mentioned how complete tactical surprise had been achieved, how the enemy had been completely deceived about British strength and intentions. He didn't name Barkas. The operation was still classified, but Churchill knew what the Camouflage director had accomplished. Operation Bertram became the template for future Allied deception operations. Its success proved that large-scale visual deception could work against modern reconnaissance. That dummy equipment could fool trained intelligence analysts. That canvas and wood could change the course of battles. But Bertram was just the beginning. What Barkas had developed in North Africa would be refined, expanded, and deployed on an unprecedented scale for the greatest deception operation in history. Operation Fortitude, the deception for D-Day. By late 1943, Allied planning for the invasion of France was well underway. The invasion would come in Normandy. Everyone knew it had to come in France. The question was where. The Germans knew it was coming. They were fortifying the entire Atlantic coast. They were positioning panzer divisions. They were building obstacles on beaches. The Allies needed the Germans to position their forces in the wrong place. They needed a deception that would make Hitler believe the invasion was coming at Pas-de-Calais, the narrowest point of the English Channel. If German armour was concentrated at Calais when Allied forces landed at Normandy, the invasion would succeed. Operation Fortitude was born. The plan was staggering in scope. Create an entire phantom army in southeastern England. The 1st United States Army Group, FUSAG, commanded by General George Patton. FUSAG would appear to be preparing for an invasion at Calais. Dummy aircraft, dummy landing craft, dummy tanks, fake radio traffic, double agents feeding false information to German intelligence. The dummy equipment for Fortitude was more sophisticated than anything used at El Alamein. By 1944, inflatable technology had advanced. Rubber tanks that could be inflated in minutes, realistic from any angle, light enough that two men could carry them, durable enough to withstand wind and rain. American engineers developed most of the inflatable equipment. But the techniques were Barkas's. The principles were his. Make it look real from the enemy's perspective. Create supporting evidence. Maintain it constantly. Never let the illusion break. Fortitude succeeded. German intelligence identified Fusog as a massive invasion force. They estimated 50 divisions in southeastern England. They positioned panzer reserves to counter the Calais invasion. When Allied forces landed at Normandy on June 6, 1944, German commanders believed it was a feint. The real invasion, they thought, would come at Calais. They held their panzer divisions back, waiting for Fusag, waiting for Patton, waiting for an invasion force that was rubber and canvas and brilliant deception. By the time they realized their mistake, Allied forces had secured the beachhead. The invasion succeeded, and a significant part of that success was owed to techniques Barkas had pioneered in the Egyptian desert. Barkas himself didn't work on fortitude. After El Alamein, he returned to less dramatic assignments. He supervised camouflage operations in Tunisia. He trained new camouflage officers. He wrote training manuals. In 1943, Barkas returned to England. The war in Europe was progressing. His techniques were being used at scales he'd never imagined, but his role was largely done. The Middle East Command Camouflage Directorate had accomplished its mission. After the war, Barkas returned to filmmaking. He worked for the rank organization making children's films. The Little Ballerina and others. Nothing glamorous, nothing that would make his name famous, just honest work. He rarely talked about his wartime service. Operation Bertram remained classified for years. The full details weren't published until the 1970s. By then, most people had forgotten. The soldiers who'd fought at El Alamein knew, the generals knew, but the wider public didn't understand that a filmmaker with canvas and wood had helped win one of the war's decisive battles. Barkas died on September 3, 1979, age 83. His obituaries mentioned his war service briefly. Most focused on his film career. That was fine with him. He'd never sought recognition. He'd been a problem solver. The army had a problem. He'd solved it. That was enough. But his legacy lived on in unexpected ways. Military academies studied Operation Bertram. Deception became a formal military discipline. NATO forces developed dedicated deception units. The principles Barkas established, creating visual deceptions that could fool modern reconnaissance, became standard doctrine. The inflatable tanks used in Fortitude and later operations were direct descendants of Barkas's dummy tanks, lighter, more sophisticated, but conceptually identical. Make fake equipment look real. Support it with authentic evidence. Maintain the illusion until the enemy commits forces based on false intelligence. During the Cold War, both sides used deception extensively. Soviet forces deployed dummy missile launchers to complicate NATO targeting. American forces used dummy aircraft to protect real assets. The techniques continued evolving, but the foundation was El Alamein. In 2011, historians gained access to declassified German intelligence reports from 1942. The documents confirmed what Barkas had suspected. German analysts had completely believed the southern buildup was real. They'd counted the tanks. They'd tracked the pipeline construction. They'd estimated attack timing based on when the preparations would be complete. They'd been comprehensively deceived. Rommel himself had positioned forces based on those reports. He'd believed Montgomery would attack from the south. He'd allocated reserves accordingly. When the northern attack came, he was caught off balance. His forces were in the wrong positions. His counterattack was delayed. The battle was lost. One document in particular stood out. A German intelligence assessment from October 22, 1942, the day before the battle. It stated with confidence that British forces in the southern sector numbered approximately 600 tanks, 100 artillery pieces, and supporting infantry. It estimated the attack would come in early November after the pipeline was complete. Every single detail was wrong, and every single detail had been carefully planted by Barkas and his team. That was the true measure of Operation Bertram's success. Not just that the deception worked, but that it worked so completely that German intelligence never suspected they'd been deceived. They analyzed the evidence. They drew logical conclusions. They made tactical decisions based on those conclusions, and all of it was based on canvas, wood, and theatrical genius. Barkas understood something fundamental about deception. It's not enough to show the enemy what you want them to see. You have to show them what they expect to see. German intelligence expected British forces to mass in the south. The terrain was better there. The approaches were more favorable. Tactically, it made sense. So Barkas gave them exactly what they expected. A slow, methodical build-up, a pipeline under construction, tank concentrations forming, everything logical, everything predictable, everything wrong. The Germans never questioned it because it matched their preconceptions. That's the art of deception, not contradicting enemy expectations, but confirming them while simultaneously implementing the complete opposite. Modern military deception still follows Barkas's principles. Create a narrative the enemy will believe. Support it with evidence that confirms their assumptions. Maintain it consistently, and strike when they're committed to the wrong conclusion. Technology has changed. Satellite reconnaissance replaced aerial photography. Electronic warfare replaced dummy radio traffic. But the fundamentals remain. Deception works when it tells a story the enemy wants to believe. Barkas never claimed to have invented military deception. Deception has existed since warfare began. What he did was systematize it, turn it into a reproducible process, demonstrate that visual deception could work at operational scale against modern intelligence. Before Barkas, military camouflage was mostly about hiding things. After Barkas, it was about creating false realities, not just making tanks invisible, but making phantom armies visible. That shift in thinking changed how modern militaries approach deception. The dummy tanks at El Alamein weren't just props, they were characters in a story about British forces preparing to attack from the south, a story supported by pipelines and supply dumps and cooking fires and track marks, a story so convincing that German intelligence never questioned its truth. That was Barkas's genius. He understood that deception wasn't a single trick. It was a complete production. Every detail had to support the narrative. Any inconsistency would break the illusion. In filmmaking, one wrong prop can ruin a scene. One anachronistic detail can pull the audience out of the story. Military deception operates by the same rules. One dummy tank positioned incorrectly can alert enemy analysts. One supply dump without proper evidence of use can raise suspicions. Barkas treated Operation Bertram like the biggest film production of his career. He was the director, his camoufleurs were the crew, the desert was the set, and the audience was Rommel's intelligence officers watching through reconnaissance cameras from 10,000 feet. The film had to be perfect. The lighting had to be right. Shadows had to fall correctly. Movement had to look natural. Evidence of human activity had to appear authentic. One mistake and the entire production would fail. It didn't fail. It succeeded beyond anyone's expectations. And in succeeding, it proved that creativity and technical skill could achieve what traditional military force couldn't. 600 canvas tanks defeated German intelligence more effectively than 600 real tanks would have. That's the lesson modern militaries took from Operation Bertram. Force isn't always the answer. Sometimes deception is more effective. Sometimes making the enemy look the wrong way is better than confronting them directly. Barkas died before the full impact of his work was understood. He never knew that his techniques would be studied in military academies worldwide. He never knew that Operation Bertram would be considered one of the most successful deception operations in military history. He just knew that it worked. That Montgomery broke through at El Alamein, that Rommel retreated, that the war in North Africa turned, and that his canvas tanks had played a part. That was enough. If this story moved you the way it moved us, do me a favor, hit that like button. Every single like tells YouTube to show this story to more people. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We're rescuing forgotten stories from dusty archives every day. Stories about filmmakers who saved armies with canvas and creativity. Real people, real heroism. Drop a comment right now and tell us where you're watching from. Are you watching from Texas, Germany, United States, Japan? Our community stretches across the entire world. You're not just a viewer, you're part of keeping these memories alive. Tell us your location. Tell us if someone in your family served. Just let us know you're here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for making sure Geoffrey Barkas doesn't disappear into silence. He deserves to be remembered, and you're helping make that happen.